This is the CBS Evening News. Dan Rather reporting. Good evening. President Reagan tonight delivers an election year State of the Union message, setting the stage for his final year in office. Democrats are preparing to respond with alternate views. Against that backdrop, a CBS News New York Times poll out tonight indicates the nation is now less optimistic about the future than it was when Mr. Reagan first took office. CBS News White House correspondent Bill Plant has our coverage of the State of the Union 1988.
As he begins his final year in office, President Reagan's State of the Union address is short on specifics and long on philosophy, but it does highlight several immediate goals. Mr. Reagan will urge ratification of the new treaty with the Soviets on medium-range nuclear missiles and continued progress toward a more sweeping long-range missile agreement. He will also make a plea for new aid to the Contra rebels in Nicaragua. No specifics tonight, but the request has already been scaled back in the face of heavy opposition in Congress, and administration sources say they are now willing to put all lethal aid aside while peace negotiations continue. However, a new CBS News New York Times poll shows that Americans continue to overwhelmingly oppose any kind of aid to the Contras.
I would guess the White House is looking for some creative packaging in an effort to obtain the votes. It's going to be very difficult.
Another difficult goal tops the president's domestic priorities, reform of the budget process aimed at cutting the federal deficit. Why not, Mr. Reagan will ask, a simple partnership, a joint agreement that sets out the spending priorities? But Democrats accustomed to annual budget battles are skeptical.
Unfortunately, I fear that he's going to choose the route of confrontation, of high level of rhetoric, of finger pointing.
Even as the president prepares to trumpet his accomplishments tonight, our poll shows that 40% of Americans think the state of the nation has gotten worse in the last 5 years. The number is the highest since 1983.
People are anxious about the future. I think they see a brush fire out there in the hills. The symbol of that brush fire is the deficit, and it seems to be getting closer.
But Ronald Reagan wants America to feel good, not anxious. So he'll talk about the things that concern people: better education, curbing drug use, world peace. And this year he will once again single out someone as an American hero. It's all part of the positive buildup to what the president calls a big finish to his presidency. Bill Plant, CBS News, the White House.
The CBS News New York Times poll out tonight indicates trouble for Gary Hart's rerun campaign. Hart is still frontrunner among the Democratic hopefuls. However, our recent re-interviews with most of Hart's own supporters in the poll show a shift. More than a quarter of them now say they don't want Hart to win the nomination. This follows the latest accusations that Hart's 1988 and 1984 campaigns received secret and possibly illegal contributions and other help. Among Republicans, the poll indicates Vice President George Bush is the national frontrunner and Senator Bob Dole is second. In Iowa, however, now 2 weeks before the important caucuses, most polls, including our own, show Bush trailing Dole in Iowa. And still to come on tonight's CBS Evening News, we'll ask Vice President George Bush the questions that keep coming up in his presidential campaign. A live interview with Mr. Bush on arms to Iran and money to the Contras.
What'll it be?
Nothing, honey.
Just stop by to see me, huh, sugar?
Kellogg's Nut and Honey Crunch.
This tastes good.
It's nothing, honey.
Well, still good.
Kellogg's Nut and Honey Crunch.
Delicious cereal, Jensen. What is it?
Nothing, honey.
You love the honey, you love the nuts.
When you've got the taste of nuts and honey all wrapped up in a hearty crunch, what more can you say?
Hey, Cookie, what's for breakfast?
Nothing, honey.
Kellogg's Nut and Honey Crunch.
One of the most striking results of today's CBS News New York Times poll is that many felt, rightly or wrongly, that Vice President Bush is hiding information that the public ought to know, despite the fact that it is a fact that the Tower Commission and the Iran-Contra Committee did not implicate Mr. Bush. Almost 1/3 of all Republicans and 1/4 of the Bush supporters interviewed say he is hiding something. CBS News has spent more than a month preparing tonight's report on the Vice President and the Iran-Contra affair. During that period, the Vice President has asked reporters, all reporters, to submit substantive questions if they want to ask questions in writing, and he has issued one written response. He declined to be interviewed in advance for our report, but he watches with us tonight from his Capitol Hill office, and he agreed to respond this evening on the condition that he speak live and unedited. First, our report.
The question about arms for hostages has been answered over and over again.
far as I'm concerned, that all questions have been answered.
Yet questions remain about Vice President Bush's role in the Iran arms sale. He insists he was out of the loop, uninformed about the events and the risks of the Iran initiative. But the record shows Mr. Bush attended more than 15 meetings in the Oval Office at which the arms sales were discussed. But he says he cannot recall hearing any strong objections. In his most recent account, Mr. Bush writes, "Had there been any strenuous objection, I am sure I would have remembered it." The record shows Bush was there when Secretary of State Schulz argued against the arms sales. Quote, "As forcefully as I could. I was intense." The Vice President now says he would have objected to the plan if only he had known the real terms.
But I wish with clairvoyant hindsight that I had known that we were trading arms for hostages as the report concluded, and then I would have weighed in very heavily with the President to that effect.
But the record shows he did know. Mr. Bush was told it was an arms for hostages swap by this man, Amiron Nir, the Israeli who coordinated the trade. At a briefing arranged by Oliver North, Nir told Bush directly the deal was an effort to get the hostages out, the whole package for a fixed price. They fear that if they give us all the hostages, they won't get anything from us. So Mr. Bush was told in July 1986 that we were trading arms for hostages with the most radical elements in Iran. But the record shows he never objected. For all the questions about the Iran arms deal, there are even more about the Vice President's link to secret Contra aid. The Vice President's office says he and his aides were never involved in directing, coordinating, or approving military aid to the Contras. But the record is riddled with inconsistencies. Questions center on this man, Donald Gregg, Bush's national security advisor and a veteran CIA agent. When the Sandinistas shot down the plane carrying Eugene Hasenfus, the first U.S. official alerted was Gregg's assistant. Yet Gregg denied it.
But he contacted someone who worked for you?
No.
He contacted you indirectly in some way?
No.
Gregg later admitted that wasn't true. But then just 3 days ago, Gregg again denied any involvement with the Contras.
Mr. Gregg, do you still insist that you played no role in aiding the Contras between 1982 and 1987?
Yes, I do.
But the record shows Gregg pushed for more secret aid to Contras early in 1982 when he was responsible for covert operations at the NSC. After he joined Bush's staff, Gregg promoted a plan to launch airstrikes against leftist guerrillas in Central America. Targets included Nicaragua. The plan was found in Oliver North's safe. Its author, Felix Rodriguez. A Bay of Pigs veteran, Rodriguez had worked for Gregg on secret CIA operations in Vietnam. Just after U.S. aid to the Contras was made illegal, Gregg met Rodriguez again. That same day, Rodriguez met North for the first time. A month later, Rodriguez joined the Vice President and Gregg to discuss a job in El Salvador. All three men say they talked about fighting communist insurgents. All three claim the Contras never came up.
I have never, ever had a discussion with him about the Contras and Contra support of any kind.
The record shows Rodriguez was in Central America just 2 weeks later. General Paul Gorman, the U.S. military commander in the region, reported Rodriguez was sent by Ollie North, and his primary commitment was to assist the FDN, the Contras. We asked Gregg about that last Friday.
I've heard about that memorandum, and I have no explanation for it.
By fall, Rodriguez was managing North's Contra supply flights from El Salvador. But North grew uneasy about Rodriguez. He wrote in his notebook, "Felix talking too much about Vice President connection." Rodriguez stayed in touch with Bush's office. By April, he was threatening to quit. Rodriguez came to Washington for a series of meetings, including one with Mr. Bush and Donald Gregg. A briefing memo prepared for the Vice President listed the topic as resupply of the Contras. Bush and his aides claim the subject never came up. By summer, relations between North and Rodriguez grew tense. North asked Gregg for help, telling him, "You're the only one who can control Felix." Gregg and Rodriguez met in the Vice President's office that August. Rodriguez told him North was supplying the Contras with arms. But Gregg claims he never told Bush because the information was not vice presidential. Today, Donald Gregg still works inside the White House as Vice President Bush's trusted advisor. Mr. Vice President, thank you for being with us tonight. Donald Gregg still serves as your trusted advisor. He was deeply involved in running arms to the Contras, and he didn't inform you. Now, when President Reagan's trusted advisor, Admiral Poindexter, failed to inform him, the president fired him. Why is Mr. Gregg still inside the White House and still a trusted advisor?
Because I have confidence in him, and because this matter, Dan, as you well know, and your editors know, has been looked at by the $10 million study by the Senate and the House. It's been looked at by the Tower Commission. The Rodriguez testimony that you put on here, I just think it's outrageous because he was totally vindicated, swore under oath that he never talked to me about the Contras, and yet this report you're making, which you told me, or your people did, you have a Mr. Cohen that works for you, was going to be a political profile. Now, if this is a political profile for an election, I have a very different opinion as to what one should be. But Don Gregg works for me because I don't think he's done anything wrong. And I think if he had this exhaustive examination that was gone into by the Senate and by the House, would have showed it. And you've impugned my integrity by suggesting with one of your little boards here that I didn't tell the truth about what Felix Rodriguez. You didn't accuse me of it, but you made that suggestion. And other people were in the meeting, including Mr. Nick Brady, and he has said that my version is correct. And so I find this to be a rehash and a little bit, if you'll excuse me, a misrepresentation on the part of CBS, who said you're doing political profiles on all the candidates, and then you come up with something that has been exhaustively looked into.
Mr. Vice President, what we agreed to or didn't agree to, I think you will agree for the moment, can be dealt with in another way. Let's talk about the record. You say that we've misrepresented your record. Let's talk about the record. If we've misrepresented your record in any way, here's a chance to set it straight.
Right. Now, I just set it straight on one count because you implied from that little thing, I have a little monitor sitting on the side here, that I didn't tell the truth. Now, this has all been looked into.
Where did we imply that, Mr. Vice President?
Well, just here on this board where you had the idea that Bush says that he didn't hear about the Contra supply from Felix Rodriguez. Felix Rodriguez testified under oath. He has been public, and you could have at least run a little picture of him saying that I never told the Vice President about the Contras. I'm asking for fair play, and I thought I was here to talk about my views on education or on getting this deficit down.
Well, Mr. Vice President, we want to talk about the record on this because
let's talk about
the framework here is that one third of the Republicans in this poll, one-third of the Republicans, and 1/4 of the people who say that, they rather like you, believe you're hiding something. Now, if you are, here's a chance to get it out.
You know what I'm hiding? What I told the president. That's the only thing. And I've answered every question put before me. Now, if you have a question, what is it? I do
have one.
Please.
I have one.
Please fire
away. You have said that if you had known, this was an arms for hostages swap, that you would have opposed it. You also said that you did not know that
May I answer that?
That wasn't a question. It was a statement.
Yes, it was a statement, and
let me ask the question if I may first.
The president created this program, has testified or stated publicly he did not think it was arms for hostages. And it was only later that, and that's me, because I went along with it, because you know why, Dan? Because I worried when I saw Mr. Buckley, heard about Mr. Buckley being tortured to death, later admitted as the CIA chief. So if I erred on the side of trying to get those hostages out of there.
Mr. Vice President, you set the rules for this talk here. I didn't mean to step on your line there, but you insisted that this be live, and you know that we have a limited amount of time.
That's why I want to get my share in here on something other than what you want to talk about.
The President has spoken for himself. I'm asking you to speak for yourself, which you have not been willing to do in the past. And if I may suggest that this is what leads people to say, quote, either George Bush was irrelevant or he was ineffective. He said himself he was out of the loop. Now, let me give you an example. You said ask a question.
May I explain out of the loop? No operational role. Go ahead.
Now, you've said that if you'd known it was an arms for hostages swap, you would have opposed it. You said the first you knew it was an arms for hostages swap was in December of 1986,
when the whole thing became briefed to me by Senator Durenberger.
Exactly.
And the proximity of arms to hostages much closer.
But, Mr. Vice President, you went to Israel in July of 1986, and a member of your own staff, Mr. Craig Fuller, has verified, and so did the only other man there, Mr. Nir, Mr. Amaron Nir, who's the Israelis' top anti-terrorist man.
Yes.
Those two men were in a meeting with you, and Mr. Nir not once but three times underscored with you that this was a straight-out arms for hostages swap.
What they were doing.
Now,
Read the memo.
How do you
Read the memo. What they were doing.
How can you reconcile that you were there, Mr. Nir, underscored 3 separate occasions that it was an arms for hostages swap and told you were dealing with the most radical elements in Iran? You were dealing straight away with the Ayatollah Khomeini.
I was told what they were doing and not what we were doing. And that's the big difference. And Dan, I expressed my concerns and reservations about that. That has been testified to under oath by Mr. Poindexter. And it's been confirmed that I had reservations and spoke up by Don Reagan. In fact, he said the other day that I expressed them to the president.
That's correct.
I don't discuss what I talk to the president because there's a principle involved. Nothing to do with Iran-Contra. It's the principle of confidentiality between the president and the vice president.
Mr. Vice President,
yes.
The president himself has said he wants all the facts out. He gave up such things as even his own diary. Every principle, including Secretary Schulz,
he
gave up some of it.
Well, Dan, let's be careful here because you're
yes, sir, I want you to be careful, Mr. Vice President, because of the problem
I will be careful, but I want to
get my side of this out. The problem here is that you repeatedly said into meetings. You said in a meeting in which Secretary Schulz, in the most forceful way, registered his objections. And then you said you never heard anybody register objections.
If it was the most forceful way, I've heard George Schulz be very, very forceful. And if I were there and he was very, very forceful at that meeting, I would have remembered that. I don't remember that.
Then how do you explain that you can't remember it and the other people at the meeting say he was apoplectic?
Maybe I wasn't there at that point.
You weren't in the meeting?
I'm not suggesting. I'm just saying I don't remember it.
I don't want to be argumentative, Mr. Vice President.
You do, Dan. No, this is not a great night because I want to talk about why I want to be president, why those 41% of the people are supporting me.
And Mr. Vice President, these questions are
judge a whole career. It's not fair to judge my whole career by a rehash on Iran. How would you like it if I judged your career by those 7 minutes when you walked off the set in New York?
Well,
now, would you like that?
Mr.
I
Vice
have
President,
respect for you, but I don't have respect for what you're doing here tonight.
Mr. Vice President, I think you'll agree that your qualifications for president and what kind of leadership you would bring to the country, what kind of government you'd have, what kind of people you have around him is much more important than what you just referred to. I'd be happy to.
I want to be judged on the whole record.
Well,
and you're not.
And I'm trying to set the record
opportunity.
straight.
You invited me to come here to talk about, I thought, the whole record.
I want you to talk about the record. You sat in a meeting with George Schulz.
Yes.
He got apoplectic when he found out that you and the president were being party of sending missiles to the Ayatollah of Iran. Can you explain how you were supposed to be the? You're an anti-terrorist expert. Iran was officially a terrorist state. You went around telling.
Explain that, Dan. I wanted those hostages. I wanted Mr. Buckley out of there.
But you made us hypocrites in the face of the world. How could you go? How could you sign on to such a policy?
Well,
and the question is, what does that tell us about your record?
Signed on to it. The same reason the president signed on to it. When a CIA agent is being tortured to death, maybe you err on the side of a human life. But everybody's admitted mistakes. I've admitted mistakes. And you want to dwell on them. And I want to talk about the values we believe in and the experience and the integrity that goes with all of this. And what's I'm going to do about education. And there's nothing new here. I thought this was a news program.
Well, I had hoped, Mr. Vice President, you would tell us to whom you expressed your reservations.
Yes, I did.
When you expressed them and what the reservations were.
Testified under oath.
What were the reservations?
Reservation about getting the control of an operation in the hands of a foreign power. Don Reagan stated the other day, and I never heard a word of it on CBS, that the Vice President, in the presence of the President, spoke up about his concern about the whole cover of an operation being blown and secret and people that you're dealing with putting their lives in jeopardy.
And you weren't concerned about sending missiles to the Ayatollah Khomeini?
Every covert action.
You weren't?
The President has explained that. The committee looked at that. And so there's nothing new on this.
Mr. Vice President, I appreciate you joining us tonight. I appreciate the straightforward way in which you've engaged in this exchange. There are clearly some unanswered questions remaining. Are you willing to go to a news conference before the Iowa caucuses, answer questions from all conferences
since March?
I gather that the answer is no. Thank you very much for being with us, Mr. Vice President. We'll be back with more news in a moment.
And they catch colds just like you. For their own achy colds, more doctors in a nationwide survey said they take the formula in Dristan than the formulas in these others combined. The Dristan formula, tablets or caplets.
Finally, there's an extra-strength antacid that doesn't taste chalky. Introducing extra-strength Maalox Whip. Extra-strength relief and smooth, creamy taste. New extra-strength Maalox Whip. Extra-strength whipped in, chalky taste wiped out.
Remember when a drive-in was $1, a hot dog was a dime, and cars were under $10,000?
Stop that, Jimmy!
Now the movie's $6. A hot dog's $1.75. And cars, well, Subaru still has an entire line of cars for under $10,000.
Stop that, Jimmy!
The more things change, the more they stay the same.
The Attorney General of Colombia, a hardliner against the country's drug gangs, was kidnapped in a bloody ambush today. A few hours later, he was found dead. At least 19 bullets hit the car carrying Attorney General Carlos Maruro Hoyos. 2 of his bodyguards were killed. Hoyos himself was wounded, and the gunman dragged him off. His body was later found a few miles away. Hoyos had been investigating the recent release from prison of alleged cocaine baron Jorge Luis Ochoa, whom the United States has been trying to extradite. Police blame the killings on drug gangs who've been on a terror campaign against anyone favoring extradition of drug dealers to the United States. About 160 Mexican coal miners were reported trapped today after an explosion in a mine about 70 miles south of the Texas border. 17 men got out, but hope was fading for the rest as fire blocked rescue efforts. The United States Senate today began considering whether to ratify the Reagan-Gorbachev missile deal, the one signed last month at the Washington summit. Besides pushing for treaty ratification in tonight's State of the Union address, Mr. Reagan sent his defense secretary and Secretary of State to Capitol Hill today to sell the treaty hard. Phil Jones covered the opening fireworks.
I am directed by the... As the INF Treaty was formally delivered to the Senate, the administration's big guns were before 2 Senate committees. In the past, they have warned against dealing with the Russians, but today they argued for ratification of this agreement to reduce European-based missiles.
We knew what we wanted, and we held out until we got it.
On balance, this treaty is a net plus militarily for us.
But hardline conservatives who want to kill this treaty were not buying.
And this treaty appears to me to be an engraved invitation to cheat. I am confident that the Soviets right now have plans to cheat. In fact, they are cheating right now.
Helms confronted Schulz with a classified document that reportedly shows that the Russians are lying about how many missiles they have deployed.
I have a hard time with this. It's labeled top secret. There are cameras all around.
The secretary bristled and refused to comment in public.
Can I get this hot document out of my hands?
Yeah.
Before I violate the law?
And give it back to me.
Senator Alan Cranston, who did read the Helms document, said that it was replete with caveats and hedges.
I am far from convinced by my reading of these 1.5 pages that the INF Treaty is fatally flawed by uncertainties about how many Soviet SS-20s there are.
As the debate proceeds, the focus will be on whether on-site verification inspection will really catch Soviet cheating and on the remaining Soviet advantage in conventional forces that threaten Europe. This debate will last for months. Some additions and clarifications are expected, but Senate leaders say they will be able to defeat any amendments that could kill the treaty. Phil Jones, CBS News, Capitol Hill.
Britain's royal family announced today that the Duchess of York, formerly Sarah Ferguson, is expecting her first child in August. She's married to Andrew, the second son of Queen Elizabeth, and the baby will be 5th in line to the British throne. That's tonight's CBS Evening News. Until our live coverage of President Reagan's State of the Union address and the Democratic response, tonight at 9 Eastern Time, Dan Rather. See you later.
Examination, a leading consumer publication, called it the best car we've ever tested. Road and Track judged that it may be the best sedan in the world. The Mercedes-Benz 300E astonished the experts. Let it astonish you.
There's one company that knows your home almost as well as you do. So when it comes time to sell, they're the people you should call. Better Homes and Gardens Real Estate Service.
You've been watching me for years now. Don't you think it's time you join me on a Carnival cruise? Come on. More people are taking vacations on Carnival. Because when you take a Carnival cruise, all your shipboard funds included in one terrific price. All your nighttime entertainment's included. All your food's included, too. Plus fantastic tropical ports of call. So on your next vacation, take a 3, 4, or 7-day cruise on Carnival, the most popular cruise line in the world.
I'm Harry Smith.
And I'm Kathleen Sullivan. Tomorrow, Secretary of State George Schultz.
Also, Andrew Lloyd Webber, the man behind Phantom of the Opera, tomorrow on CBS This Morning.
This is CBS.
Just give me honest